Now, before we start, it's important to know I'm not necessarily denying that there is a substantial claim made by any of these global warming debunkers. The purpose of this is more to show why these two individuals really should have no staying power on this subject due to the fact that all they're doing is speaking. It is true, yes, they may not have time to pull up all this evidence, but I can only assume, even in the comments or the description of the video, they could have offered some reference to, from what I could tell, multiple claims made in the name of science and evidence and results. So this is more of a reason why I think, just like how a lot of different groups that have radical opinion. So this is why I think that groups that have a very differing opinion from others get taken very non-seriously because of individuals like this. And I think it's important to not support individuals like this who only blow smoke out of their ass. So please enjoy my rebuttal for every stupid thing this so-called expert says.
Hi everybody, Stefan Molyneux from Free Domain Radio. I hope you're doing well. Here you can see with me Dr. William Happer, a professor at Princeton University in the field of atomic physics, optics, and spectroscopy.
Okay, so he's a professor in a field that, well, not exactly in the subject we're talking about. Technically, yes, atomic physics has something to do with it, but not so much the biological and geological occurrences with how these things interact. So, yeah, he's experienced. Not exactly a person I'd be holding to preach about the exact truths of these things, but carry on.
He is a director with the CO2 Coalition and served as the Department of Energy's Office of Science Director under the George H.W. Bush administration.
Okay, good. He's held a position. That's great. However, it's not a secret that usually conservatives will lean on the side of the aisle towards climate change debunking, much like the head of the EPA that has just been appointed under Donald Trump's administration. Just because he held a position does not give him any authority to talk on this, due to the fact that you don't necessarily need to be influential in the subject in order to get appointed. So this qualification of his, total bullshit. Carry on.
He will be speaking at the Global Warming An Inconvenient Lie conference in Phoenix, Arizona from December 2nd to 4th, 2016. The link will be below. It is inconvenientlie.com. Dr. Happer, thank you so much for taking the time today.
And I'm taking the time today to make sure that this all goes smoothly. Carry on.
It's been about 20 years since the predictions that originated the global warming scare, hysteria, story, fantasy, fable, whatever you want to call it, have been steadily deviating from reality.
To support their claim. Now notice here he doesn't offer any concrete example of how they've been deviating. He just mentions that they are. This is going to be one in a very long line of claims made in this video in which they just speak and there is no actual evidence, links, references, anything of the sort.
How is this being passed off as science anymore?
It's being passed off as science because on a majority, the scientific community agrees that this is an actual problem. Just because one of them, one of the outliers, minorities if you would have it, says that it is not true, doesn't mean that that is true, that it is untrue. Just because someone disagrees and you have one counterpoint to your argument does not invalidate the entire majority of the scientific community who all agree that this is a problem. People like you who then go and try and use an example to disprove mountains of evidence in science, which are readily available, unlike your counterpoints.
See, look at the beginning, I'm like, okay, well, there are all these models, it's weather, it's a complex system, there's going to be some divergence, but...
And you don't understand it! So why are you saying that, yes, there are these things, I don't understand it, it must be false?
This steady differentiation between empirical data and theoretical projections would seem to be undercutting the theory a little bit, yet still it marches on like this undead zombie.
The fact that they're even able to somehow predict much of what's actually happening, maybe not necessarily to percentage correctness, but are still accurately able to predict this, is amazing compared to your debunking, which just revolves around the fact that Oh, they're not 100% correct. They didn't deviate as little as they said they would. They deviated a little bit more. They must be false. This is bullshit.
You're right. I mean, if it were any other branch of science, it would have been abandoned a long time ago, or they would have made major changes in the theory.
It would have been abandoned a long time ago if it still didn't have relevance and it was still not true.
But they're unwilling to do that.
He says that they're unwilling to make changes in the theory. Now, as far as I know, it is a theory, yes, but it's not immune to modifications or amendments. So just because it's not 100% true, like I've said before, does not prove its falsehood.
It's amazing. I've never seen anything like it.
Except for the stubborn ignorance that is your opinion, which cannot be swayed, apparently.
But they're trying to rationalize the lack of agreement by, for example, saying that there's lots of warming, but it's being canceled by aerosols. Particulates from coal stations and stuff like that. But, that's getting harder and harder to defend. It looks like aerosols are not nearly as effective in canceling warming as people originally thought.
Unbelievable. One thing or two things, a small subset of ideas or of facts that didn't prescribe to the exact thing they said in the beginning somehow proves that it's false. They carry on with this narrative the entire time of this video, and it's very alarming because they seem to offer no evidence on their own, merely trying to prove the truthness of their claims purely based on the falsehood of a few points of their counter-argument.
So I think the most obvious thing is they've grossly exaggerated the effects of CO2 itself. That, of course, it will cause a little bit of warming, but the amount looks like it's 2, 3, 4 times smaller than what they have been assuming.
Which is, of course, in accordance with the 3 times multiplier that they tend to have applied to their original estimates in order to get this sort of runaway greenhouse effect.
What is this 3 times multiplier he's talking about? Maybe I don't know what it is. Maybe it's something he created. I have no idea, but based on the things they've been talking about so far, I honestly think they're talking out of their ass because there's no substantial proof to whatever they're claiming. So if anyone knows what this is, please let me know.
The Venus effect that they projected. So that multiplier, which a lot of people don't understand, I can look like a great businessman if I could just multiply my profits by 3, although that would actually be kind of illegal if I didn't have a basis for it. But that combined with the fact that CO2 seems to have a law of diminishing returns when it comes to global warming in terms of its capacity to trap or maintain heat increases. I wonder if you could step people through both the multiplier, and you've got a fantastic analogy about a barn being painted red that I think is a great way of explaining it.
I would love to hear this analogy. I'm sure it is very insightful.
Well, you're very familiar with the theory of global warming. My hats are off to you. Most of my academic colleagues don't know that much.
Most of your academic colleagues probably are not scientists. They're probably unknowing because they don't know. Or maybe it's because they've only listened to you ramble on about it and their minds are poisoned. I digress.
But, you can estimate the warming from doubling CO2. If nothing else changes in the atmosphere, you just double the amount of CO2. And no matter what you do, you always get around 1 degree centigrade, a little more in Fahrenheit.
Yeah, you get 1 degree centigrade change, and that's from doubling. But let's just assume right now that populations and their energy consumption grow exponentially and not linearly. So, for example, the Industrial Revolution. When this occurred, there was very low population, very low energy consumption compared to what we have now. And it's exponentially grown since then. So yes, it's doubled, but that doesn't mean that it's doubling linearly. It means it's doubling exponentially, which does not happen over a certain period of time. It happens at an increasing rate. If you double something that's been doubled, that's called quadrupled. And when you double that again, that's octupled. Things get significantly higher when you have something exponential. Look at the population graph here, back in 1950. Now look at it here in 2000. Do you notice a difference? Has it doubled? No. Has it gotten bigger? Yes, exponentially. Therefore, the exponential increase of energy consumption and production has also happened. So just because they say it has doubled, Over what period of time?
So that's often called the climate sensitivity, how much the Earth warms if CO2 doubles. You often have to wait 10 or 20 or maybe even 50 years because the ocean absorbs some heat.
Yes, he is correct here. This is one of the first correct things he's said so far. The ocean absorbs the heat. Now, I'm no ocean expert, but when water takes in heat, it also affects the currents. It also affects the ecosystem, a very fragile, fine-tuned over millions of years. So any change, significant change, in this case, possibly 1 to 2 degrees centigrade, to their environment, you will expect a very significant change. The warming of the oceans are most likely going to cause many of the things that we will see with global warming. The changing of the ocean currents will change how we see storm behavior in the Pacific and Atlantic. This will cause higher intensity hurricanes. This will cause greater amounts of rainfall. And this will also change the currents that go through all of these oceans. These will all have detrimental effects, only from a very small change.
But so they call it the equilibrium sensitivity, meaning you wait long enough for transients to die down. So 1 degree is not enough to worry anyone.
1 degree is not enough to worry anyone because that's all that we have experienced so far. You change that to 2 to 3 degrees, which is the predicted model for what will happen, and then we will have to worry. That's why we are worrying so much right now, because we know that if we do not stop, the trend will continue, and then it'll get to a point where there is no return because we weren't worrying about the effects happening in the short term. This is a long-term problem. It's not something we will see a significant change in our lifetime.
Really good for the earth. I would like to have a little longer growing season. All my backyard garden has been killed by frost, and I would have gotten a better crop this year.
This is one of the most moronic statements I've ever heard. I want a longer growing season because the winter will come later. Because the frost kills my... Are you fucking retarded? Do you understand how weather systems work? Just because the earth gets warmer does not mean that the weather system will then stay warmer for longer. Stick to your field. This is not something you can be talking about with such certainty or even joking about half-handedly. People assume that you're talking the truth due to the fact that you've spit out all of these credentials that somehow make you a arbiter of the subject. When you get these changes in the climate, it will lead to other things. It will lead to drier seasons. It'll lead to more rain. It'll lead to different storm patterns, rain patterns. Things will change. It won't give you extra time to grow your fucking crops in your backyard, you stupid bitch.
We'd have had a few more growing days. In order to alarm people, in the cynical view, they have said, well, that's only the direct effect of CO2. There are feedbacks, and there are feedbacks that amplify this warming.
Yes, there are. Now go on and somehow debunk them with no evidence whatsoever.
Positive feedbacks, and that's a little strange already because most feedbacks in nature are negative. Positive feedbacks occasionally occur, but they're very unusual. For example, in thermodynamics, one of the first things they teach you is something called Le Chatelier's principle, which says that, if you change some system, the system will try to figure out how to cancel the change, not to make it bigger.
Yes, this may be true, but that is assuming that one variable in a very fine-tuned system known as climate will somehow be able to get canceled out. Weather has a much greater effect than if we changed any other variable in this system. It can't just cancel out like 1 to 1. There has to be a lot of things that change. And guess what changes? Temperatures, weather patterns, other things. And what does that lead to? Worse things.
So they somehow convinced themselves that you could amplify these direct effects of CO2, and the mechanism that was suggested was that the main greenhouse gas is not CO2 at all, it's water vapor. So if you can somehow have a little bit of CO2 make the effects of water vapor, the warming effects, much bigger, then that would be enough to alarm people and, keep your research funding coming in indefinitely.
I would love to see the evidence to this claim that he is making right now. I'm genuinely curious. If anyone knows what he's talking about again, please let me know, but I think he's just blowing smoke out of his old crotchety ass.
So that's what they did. And now the years have passed. Those first suggestions were by one of my colleagues here at Princeton many, many years ago. And there's been time enough to see whether it works. It doesn't seem to work. It looks like...
And due to the fact that this is not working, it debunks all climate change. Wow! A suggestion, a hypothesis debunks a theory. What the fuck?
If there's any feedback at all, it is just as likely to be slightly negative. In other words, the warming may be even less than the 1 degree direct warming that people had expected.
Please provide evidence of this happening. Jesus Christ.
And so that's the situation. The warming has been disappointingly small from the point of view of the alarmists. And it's not even clear how much of the warming we've seen that is actually from CO2. There are natural fluctuations of temperature that could easily have caused it, half of it, or maybe all of it.
Natural fluctuations in temperature have been accounted for and are able to be predicted using different models. Yes, the Earth does go through natural warming and cooling cycles, but this one is happening much sooner than it was supposed to. This has been proven through, let's call evidence, yeah! Have you ever heard of ice cores? Have you heard of the ability to analyze ice cores and the level of CO2 captured inside of these ice cores that they drill from the Antarctic, from the North Pole, from anywhere where there are abilities to see into the past using data?
Well, this is the remarkable thing, is that given that we've had enough time as a species to evolve from single-celled organisms, there must have been dampeners on the complexities of the system, so that
what does that even mean?
There wouldn't be this runaway. I mean, if we were going to turn into Venus, it would have happened, billions of years ago.
What does that even mean? Venus is in a different location than the Earth. It's closer to the sun. It's going to have higher temperatures. What? That is a not. No, stop. You're stupid.
And so there must be mechanisms by which any sort of big spike or change in the system is self-correcting. And of course, one of the big...
And that big spike and that big change is global warming, which then will dissipate over a much longer period of time. Look at any ice age. The natural cycles of when the Earth does warm, the mechanism that turns it back is ice ages.
Ones is that if you get more CO2, you get more plants, and when you get more plants, they take out more CO2, and so
I don't know what to say to this. You get more CO2, you get more plants. You get more plants, you get less CO2. Now, if I remember correctly, we're also demolishing a very large portion of the ecosystems that, in your own words, would capture this CO2 and turn it back into oxygen. Now, I'm just going to assume that you're ignorant to the fact that logs are used for anything and that the Amazon is in grave danger of being completely deforested among of many other areas on this planet, which the ecosystems have been completely destroyed and all of these plants are gone. We're already taking out the plants too. So this point of your argument is already debunked by the mere fact that we are getting rid of plants as well. So this just shows me how you, in this bubble you are about how these are the things that will solve it, but I'm completely and totally just devoid of any knowledge of what's going on around me in the world. And as long as these facts support my model, they don't have to exist in the real world. They just have to make sense in my head. That's called a bubble. That's called an echo chamber. You're in an echo chamber. You're not taking in anything outside of your small space where you believe certain things to be true and other people tell you these things are true. They're not all true.
So these kinds of things, it's kind of a common sense thing. And given that CO2 was far higher in the past than it is now, if runaway CO2 was going to happen, it would have happened long before we had the chance to evolve the capacity to come up with a global warming theory.
Yes, and this has happened in the past, and it's not supposed to happen yet. So we've only had the ability to accurately predict these things in the last 200 years. So unless somehow climate changes, over long periods of time, like most people will know to be true, we have accelerated this amount of time because we're now adding to this timeline, the natural timeline that would, under normal circumstances, not take nearly as little time as it is now because of what we're doing. We evolved the theory based on, in the very recent past, being able to measure the negative effects of everything that we're doing as a species. We're able to use evidence. Evidence!
All of the evidence is there's some kind of negative feedback mechanism that's working.
I would love to see this effect in its findings and, we're coming back to this a lot, evidence that it's true. Because he's just putting this forward, not even completely understanding how it works, and just saying that he believes that this is what's going to happen. There's no way to prove that it is. But what he's ended up doing is saying that a unknown method of how we'll cancel it out is going to cancel it out. So he's defending a model that we cannot accurately predict until it happens to debunk a model that we can to some extent accurately predict, but not know until it happens. What? Do you understand how wrong that is, that he does this? How can you do this and still claim any argument whatsoever? He just, without anyone having... Somehow his grade school teacher is now a expert on this dance. How?
Now, you've also mentioned that there's a huge boon to agriculture. And of course, most people who know the crazy argument that CO2 is some kind of a pollutant rather than what we're all made of, it makes all of us.
What? What they might actually be thinking about is carbon monoxide, which is produced by burning fossil fuels, carbon dioxide being, another molecule produced in this. But yeah, it supports life. But just like anything in life, too much of one thing can no longer be a good thing.
Pollutants. But you've pointed out that CO2 has a significant benefit to agriculture just in terms of making plants more drought resistant. I wonder if you could help people sort of follow that reasoning, because I hadn't heard of it before you had mentioned it.
Well, yes, when I was in grade school, my teacher told me, well, CO2 is good because plants use CO2 to make sugar, with the aid of sunlight.
Yes, my grade school teacher, too, taught me that photosynthesis uses CO2, water, and sunlight to produce sugar. But I'm not going to use that to try and prove my theory of how global warming is good, or that it doesn't exist, or what the increase of carbon dioxide helps us. That's total bullshit.
As I grew up, to discover CO2 is called a pollutant.
Because you've probably not been listening to the correct people, or you've only been hearing what you wanted to hear, or you've been blocking out the things that you didn't want to hear. I can't really tell which one it is, but I'm just going to assume that it's whatever, CO2 smoke blew out of your ass when you came up with this idea.
Especially since each of us, with every breath we exhale, we exhale.
I'm not even going to touch on this. There is no correlation between the CO2 that living organisms breathe out to global warming. This, I don't even need to debunk the logic behind this. There is no reason to, because it is such bullshit. This guy, for every semi-smart thing or possible point that he could use to argue, he says something incredibly ignorant, incredibly dumb. I can't even take him seriously with his credentials, with how many things he's been spurting off. It seems like he, as well, is in an echo chamber where he might say something, but no one else can hear it. So, no, I'll just say something else that then reinforces my point. It's going to bounce back, and it's going to make me have the good warm fuzzies.
40,000 parts per million CO2, which is 100 times more than is in the in the atmosphere now. So you have to scratch your head and think, why is it a pollutant if I'm exhaling this stuff?
Do you know what else is a pollutant? Stupid ideologies.
And indeed, plants are really happy to have more CO2. They're in a kind of a CO2 famine now.
Plants are in a CO2 famine. Is that because there is less of them? No. Is that because there's more CO2? Well, that couldn't possibly be true. I mean, most of our burning of fossil fuels, our exhaling, as you say, produces a very large amount of this pollutant. So how are they in a famine? That's odd. Well, that
with respect to geological history, if you look over the last 600 million years or so, 550.
How can we look over the last 600 million years if every time you say that we can't predict anything greater than the small time that we're able to measure ourselves with our eyes, with our feelings? How can you say that? How can you say, look at this very large expanse of time? I'm going to draw evidence from it. But I can't look at another large expanse of time in which we might be able to predict things or know things where we're not around or will not be around. Again, he is debunking himself using the logic of the argument he's trying to debunk. This is how do you have any talking when they constantly say one thing debunking your core argument?
50 so-called Phanerozoic, when there's been a good fossil record that you can use.
These fossil records can be found in ice cores. We mentioned these earlier. They hold a lot of evidence, including levels of CO2. Wait, we can look into the past and see what happened and predict our future? Is that what you're trying to tell me? Because then, well, that would kind of, invalidate your argument here.
CO2 levels have typically been 4 or 5 times higher than they are now, measured in thousands of parts per million, not hundreds of parts per million.
Degree of which we measure something does not change. I can measure something in the thousandths part per million, or just convert it using numbers to something in the hundreds parts per million. The whatever result I get is a number. The fact that whether we can measure it in one or the other doesn't make... I could measure it in the part per million and get a number, and it still wouldn't change how something's more agreeable or less agreeable based on the notation we put it in.
And plants loved it. The earth flourished, life flourished.
The earth flourished. Life flourished. Organisms that use CO2 flourished. Do you know what organisms do not flourish from CO2? Could it be aliens?
One reason is that when photosynthesis evolved, maybe 3 or 4 billion years.
3 or 4 billion years ago, the Earth was still being hit by asteroids and covered in volcanic activity because it was just created. Even a billion years after its creation, it was still coming together. Not to mention, that, big Mars-sized planet that hit us and created that white thing in the sky that comes out and goes away. Yeah, 3 or 4 billion years ago, nothing flourished because everything was on fire!
It was a long time ago from the geological evidence.
There is no geological evidence remaining from 3 to 4 billion years ago. If there is, it's not from Earth. It's from asteroids. And as far as I've checked, asteroids are not Earth. As far as I've checked, you're an idiot. Now, I could go on for hours on just rebuttaling every single thing that these guys say, because they have a lot to say. But it's already a 30-minute video, and I've only gotten through about 12 minutes of their content. So if you would like to watch the original video, it is here. If you would like me to comment on anything specific they said in the video, please link the timestamp in their video, and I will offer my rebuttal. Hopefully, we can start some sort of discussion on how to accurately argue the talking points of global warming and its truehood or falsehood, and move away from just making wild, substantial claims without any real evidence, or pretty much in their case, just talking out of their ass. So, let's have a discussion down in the comments. Please remember, peer-reviewed, accepted sources, not something you Googled, not something you found on Wikipedia. Please, something that's tangible, something that you can present. We don't do feelings here. We do opinions that can be discussed, that can be seen by others, that can be accredited to real sources. So please, let's have a conversation. Squiddard out.